Morning, everyone. Welcome to Our Homes, Ending the Housing Crisis. Our special guest tonight is Assemblymember Alex Lee of California. He was born in San Jose to immigrant parents from Hong Kong, graduated from Milpitas High School in 2013, and graduated then with degrees in political science and communications from the University of California at Davis, where he was also the student body president. He interned for several other elected officials, including Mike Honda, Ed Chow, Evan Lowe, and his predecessor, Kansen Chu. And in 2020, he became the youngest member of California's legislature after winning a very competitive election against a crowded field. And so today he represents the 25th Assembly District, including Fremont, Newark, and Santa Clara County as well. Alex, it's so great to welcome you to Our Homes.
Thank you so much for having me. And by the miracle of technology, I'm with you at the same time in Hawaii time.
Great. Well, I understand that you have a PowerPoint about your new social housing proposal. And so please take it away.
Yes, I have a PowerPoint or some slide decks that I think your staff have. I think. So if whoever is on here can help us with the share screen.
Okay. Do you want to do it or should we do it?
Yes, if you have them. I do not have the slides with me. Sorry, I can try to pull one too.
We can try to find it. Sorry.
All right, hold on. I got it. Okay. I got it. Oh, no, just kidding.
Okay, I was able to find it.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Sorry about that, everyone. We got it. Now we're in business. Okay, so this is a quick slide deck that Stanley will help me go through. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be here. Inviting me to be here. I'm Alex Lee. I'm the state assembly member for California's South Bay area, just across the Pacific Ocean. And I have a bill that is pending before our state legislature, Assembly Bill 2053, which will help us achieve social housing for all. Now, social housing, as pictured here, is actually in many ways across the developed world in Europe and in Asia, how countries provide housing as a municipal good, as a social good for all. What we're seeing in this picture here is actually social housing in Vienna. It's a bit atypical. Not all the buildings are as grandiose and beautiful like this level. It's kind of this modern look, but this is one of the most famous instances of social housing in Vienna in Austria. So if we can go to the next slide, it would be great. So what is social housing? Social housing is for everyone. Social housing is mixed income, publicly developed housing for all. Unlike the US public housing with a storied past, it avoids concentrated poverty by having a true mix of incomes. And in Vienna, they have the great saying of that they've got rock stars, politicians, people on welfare, all living in the same neighborhood. And that I think is a true melting pot and true equality that we can all get behind in our neighborhoods. And the idea of social housing really is that it is also not dependent on a convoluted tax scheme structure that exists like in America, or subsidies coming from one source to the other. But what we have is called rent solidarity or cross-subsidization, wherein higher income households help offset the rents of lower income households in their same neighborhoods. That's rent solidarity or cross-subsidization. And that allows a community to be self-sustaining and those dividends to be reinvested within the community so that people from all walks of life can live together. All right, let's go to the next one. So some of the benefits of social housing. Some of the benefits of social housing, of course, are that we will be prioritizing them being oriented around transit. There'll be transit-oriented locations, that they'll have a strong community where all people of all income levels, strong governance, and the ability to govern for themselves too. Social housing would also develop mixed income neighborhoods. That's really important because we want to avoid social stratification, social segregation, and we also ideally will get to a place where no resident spends more than 30% of their income on rent. And that's the goal that's also stated within the bill in California in general. All right, let's go to the next one. Thank you. So this is really an overview of the bill itself. The bill itself is like 20 pages long. So I will just break down 3 of the main segments in it. So in the beginning segment, we have what's called, we talk about governance. What we're creating with this act is this California Housing Authority, which will be the public interest developer to get us to be able to develop and create housing. That will be, so the CHA, the California Housing Authority, will be governed by a board of 9 people, including 3 representatives of residents themselves. And that fits in the line of our resident empowerment, which is also a key tenet of social housing. Each neighborhood social housing will also have a local governance council that gives residents democratic control over neighborhood amenities, maintenance, rules, and resident rights. So that really determines the rights of the residents and what we do with those renovation funds, etc. We also have 2 chapters about production and acquisition. We ideally are producing sustainable union-built housing that will last the ages, that is beautiful, affordable, and dignified. That is the idea of this. CHA will also be seeking the local input of new neighborhood construction. We're duty bound in the law to seek the input of local cities or counties, whatever the most appropriate jurisdiction is, because we don't obviously want to build without consensus. That's not the idea of this. It's not the idea to vastly change community without their input, but to meet their goals. In California, and I don't know if this is the case in Hawaii, but we have something called RHNA. RHNA is the way in which we measure the progress in which cities meet their housing goals. I think there will be some slides about this later, but very few cities actually meet this. So we're using social housing as a tool to meet the production of especially affordable housing. We're, of course, going to be prioritizing building near transit. And we're also going to, in the acquisition aspect of it, prioritize acquiring housing that has a risk of losing affordability. What's that? And that's housing that usually has, by law or deed, affordability built into rent control places. And oftentimes those places are very lucrative. They are places that people want to, especially private investors, want to buy up and flip into profit. And of course, when you flip units, you don't create actually a new housing, you're displacing people. So you also want to have acquisition in there to be able to be a entity to preserve affordable housing too. Is as important as it is to produce affordable housing, we also need to preserve some. We also have, of course, strong resident rights and protections I talked about. We have at least, at the bare minimum, the same strong protection in California that folks enjoy in the private market. We also have 2 models of ownership, 2 models of residency that's based on the Singaporean model in Asia that I'm sure Senator Chang has talked about. We have the rental model, which is a more typical renting, right? Short-term leases. And we have the ownership model, which is effectively a very long-term 99-year lease that provides you long-term economic and housing security. It also affords options to appreciate your asset of the home and sell back at a modest profit. Of course, it is not meant to be a vehicle in which investors game just like they do in the open market right now, but this is a modest means of wealth generation across generations. Wealth generation across generations. 2 types of generation. Okay, let's go to the next one. All right. So the current model of housing right now, especially when it comes to nonprofit housing, is this, right? It requires more government funding every 30 to 55 years. And if renewed funding cannot be found, housing is often converted into market rate. And there is far more demand for this funding than supply, which is oversubscribed funding in any state or federal coffers, which means we have less affordable housing preserved or built. Social housing, in contrast, is self-sustaining after the initial funding, which we say is always the seed funding, right? Because of cross-subsidization, they're able to recycle the money within its own development. We're able to not depend on an external source of funding, and that These over time will be permanently self-sustaining. This will allow us to produce more affordable housing and also produce housing that cannot be sold to for-profit entities for the duration of the useful lifetime. So it's a critical tool to filling our gap of the housing crisis. Let's go to the next one. I think we're going to have Marina next one. Yes, so social housing defined and paid for. So in the bill itself, we have a definition of what social housing is if you are unfamiliar with it. But the important tenets of social housing is that it is mixed income, has strong protections for its residents. The homes are protected from sales of for-profit entities, so from danger of privatization, and there's democratic governance by residents. These are the core tenets of what social housing is, especially in the United States. Now, in every country, abroad, there are slightly different variations of this, but these are the general tenets of what social housing is. And funding-wise, in our state, California, we are going to be building not for profit, but for the maximum social good. We are going to get seed funding to create the entity. But later on, we are going to have capital expenses funded through the issuance of bonds, which hopefully will come in the next couple of years. And cross-subsidization itself will then result in long-term sustainability. What we are thinking about is getting the money to go build, right? And then later on, once it's built, it's kind of like planting the seed, right? Once you plant the seed and you give it a little water, it will grow and grow on its own. And that's the beauty of it. Very much parting from the more traditional sense of public housing in the United States. All right, let's go to the next one real quick. That's all right. And of course, as many of you know, in Hawaii, as in California, homeownership is increasingly out of touch. So in my home area, in my district, fewer than 1 in 5 Bay Area residents can afford to buy in the local market. In fact, the houses in front of my house, I think they sold for 1.4 and 1.6 million. And that's pretty average now. I think we're getting into the 1 to 2 million now. And 4 in 10 households in California are burdened with unaffordable housing costs. So that's exceeding 30% of their household income they spend on housing. It's 4 in 10 households in California, 40% of the population. And in the Bay Area, the median home price for a home has hit $1.15 million in November, more than triple average. I think that's starting to climb still, but this illustrates how dire the need is. Okay, let's go to the next one, Stanley. It's all right. And as I illustrated before, RHNA is the way in which we measure our goals in California of producing different levels of affordable housing based on income bands. Only 3% of all cities in California meet their RHNA goals. And those are assessed almost just under every decade. There's clearly a giant gap. We're so behind that we need to build 3.5 million homes just to meet the current dire need. Let's go to the next one. Oh, okay, this is already a conclusion. So the concluding remarks, and we're going to talk more about this with Stanley about it, is this bill is going to set the groundwork for us to build social housing and to build housing that is true social good. The idea is that instead of relying on the private market, which obviously has a strong interest in the ROI, in return on investment, we need to make sure that we have more options that are not just building for profit. When you build for profit, you are deliberately not able to build as many affordable units as possible. So that is why it's important to have these tools. There's a lot of great social benefit. And the great goal of this bill is eventually we will get California to a place where no one has to pay more than 30% of their household income on housing costs. So that's going to be really important. So that was my really quick overview of it. I think there might be one more slide, maybe, Stanley. Let's see. Oh, yes. For ways to get more involved and learn more, you can visit our website, which is californiasocialhousing.org. You can sign up to learn more. You can find out more and see how you can even help to get it passed. And my staff contact, Maria in my legislative office, is there. You can call us. You can email Maria and find out more about it. So thank you so much. And that concludes the presentation aspect of this part. Thank you, Stanley, for playing tech for me. Appreciate that.
Well, let me thank Chelsea in our office, who was actually quick on the trigger finger there. Thank you so much for that really intriguing presentation. You've proposed a really bold vision, and There's a lot of robust interest in it, even just in this meeting. And so for our audience, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A feature of this Zoom webinar. Let me start by asking a more general question. So in the jurisdictions with housing shortages in this country, we've seen two broad approaches. One is a deregulatory approach, less government. For example, by allowing more homes to be built on single-family lots, an approach that was embodied by Senate Bill 9 that passed in California last year, which allows 4 units on every single-family lot. But the opposite approach is to have greater government involvement. In this case, social housing, where the government would directly be building the units that people would be living in. Why is it that you chose this second approach, the greater government involvement approach, rather than the doubling down on the deregulatory, less government approach?
Well, first of all, and it's a great question, Senator Chang. I am a true believer in, above all, we need to do all we can to confront the very vast housing crisis that's in front of us. So I am a supporter of as many common sense action items or common sense measures we can as possible. But I think it's important that we are in the driver's seat when it comes to our land use decisions and producing affordable housing. It's because I think that's the missing piece of the puzzle, right? Even though the state or a society demands ambitious goals for more affordable housing to be built, or we have more ideas about how we want the built environment to be, we as the public actually don't have any real tools when it comes to deciding that fate, right? We rely on, by and large, the private market to do it, right? And there's so much angst and different levels of anxiety about the private development and private housing that exists in our communities. And I think a lot of that lack stems from the feeling that there's no resident empowerment, or the idea that someone else can come in and do these things. And I get it. I understand those are all valid concerns to different degrees, but we need to have all the options on the table. And one thing that we really lack, especially compared to our peers on the global stage, is a strong municipal role when it comes to provision of housing. We do this with our roads, we do this with our schools, we do this with every other essential need, but we don't do this housing. That's what other countries have figured out, and they've been doing housing or social housing for as long as, or if not longer sometimes, than we have tried to do in this country. It's important that we have all the options on the table.
Well, you already mentioned some of the pitfalls of the private developers, and one of them is, of course, the concern that private developers are not producing housing that is truly affordable to those who need it the most. We might think of the folks at the 30 to 60% of AMI level that are, grossly underserved by existing programs like the Housing Choice Voucher, like LIHTC. In the, price and income distribution of the units that you're seeking to create, what price points would you be looking to create?
Yeah, we're definitely trying to accommodate based on area and median income, based on say different bands of area and median income. So our goal is obviously not to have folks have to spend more than 30% of their incomes on rent or on their housing. But at the same time, we also don't want to be so restrictive in the old public housing kind of model, or the US policy model, where it discourages graduation in different bands, or growth in socioeconomic status. So we really envision it to be your rent is tied to your income level, right? So as you grow, hopefully or decline maybe in your earnings, your housing contribution will be reflective of that. So that's the idea of it. And that's also the beauty of what we have across subsidization, that able to have that flexibility. But that's also why we want to have that kind of flexibility and base it off of people's incomes.
Okay, well, another issue that comes up all the time here in Hawaii is, since we're dealing with these very long-term leases, like 99 years, a couple questions seem to come up all the time that have already been reflected among our audience. So what happens if you're the owner and a certain number of years pass, and then you pass away, and there's still a large number of years left on the lease? And if and when you do decide to sell the unit, would there be the option to sell it for a market price or to make a profit off that unit? And if not, how would those resale market prices be regulated?
Yeah, we do have inheritance built into the bill if that is the case of needing to pass on the bill or the original leaseholder passes away. And there is also the ability for folks to sell off the unit as well. The details of what that appreciation and that wealth generation are still being determined on that aspect, but it is the balancing. What we're trying to do is making sure that people can appreciate from the asset, but not too much where people are, commoditizing our housing, right? Because the whole idea is trying not to commoditize the housing, but at the same time, we want to have some modest appreciation of wealth generation between the generations, I should say.
Yeah. Well, we are getting a ton of questions at this point, so we'll try to get to as many as we can, although I don't think we'll be able to, just given our limited time. Can you talk about the role of nonprofits, of limited equity cooperatives in owning or developing or producing these housing units?
Yeah, so in the broader definition of social housing, as reflected in this state, we want to be inclusive of mission-driven nonprofits or land trusts that set out to also embark on the preservation of housing or even creation of housing based on the same principles of social housing. So that's included in the bill. But later on, when CHA builds its own social housing units, we do also want to seek, we have allowed the local neighborhoods to partner up with nonprofits, whether it's in a managerial kind of aspect or it's a preservation aspect or some sort of guidance. We always we have that in the bill baked in so they are able to work with them. There are a lot of questions though.
Yeah. Another question that I think keeps popping up in both California and Hawaii is this question of how many units are actually needed and how many do you envision to be produced here? As you already mentioned, in Vienna, over 60% of the population lives in social housing. In Singapore, over 80%. Are you seeking to create such a universal solution as Vienna and Singapore have?
Realistically, I think in the American or California context, we may never reach the levels of Vienna. I think Vienna is actually going downward. It used to be much higher, right? Of people who lived in their social housing. I really do hope that one day we'll have a critical mass of folks that do live in social housing and are off the commoditized market. But I do think it's going to take a lot of work. And especially, we have a much more sizable population than that of Vienna and Singapore combined together with 40 million people. So I do hope that one day it will be a strong, viable alternative and something that is very commonplace and people are adjusted to, just like as they do in other countries. Singapore and Vienna are the two poster childs of social housing, but there's also other countries in the world that have some different variations of social housing that is not as prolific or common amongst folks. I do hope it's one of the many options that hopefully folks will be able to use in the future.
Have you thought about some of the first parcels that you would seek to target for development under this proposal?
Yeah, definitely. I envision that the first parcels we aim for are actually excess and surplus public lands. And when I say that, there's actually, especially in my district, there are a lot of publicly owned parking lots or defunct elementary schools. Unfortunately, a symptom of very expensive housing in California is also the declining enrollment, meaning less families move into the area, meaning less students are in the pipeline, and thus it becomes harder and harder to maintain the school infrastructure. Anyways, I really envision a lot of that excess land, like parking lots, excess schools, county. There's all sorts of parcels out there that are going to be great and ripe targets for us to develop new housing. Actually, in my district, even there is a publicly owned parking lot by transit authorities. It is between a university, literally between a university and train station. And it is a very big parking lot that the community actually in my district wants to be created and have social housing, because the pressure right now is a lot of public entities want to see workforce housing, family housing, student housing, etc., built upon these assets. But a lot of the developers want to buy the asset or own the asset outright, right? But once a public entity loses a land asset, you lose it forever, right? And you'll never get it back. And there is such such value in land right now especially in the Bay Area, especially in California, that it is one of the most expensive aspects of developing. So I really see it as like targeting those, and there's so many actually. We just had a auditor report come out about surplus properties too in California, targeting those properties that are most ideal and most suited for residential development, especially if you think about elementary school, it is more than likely going to be in a residential area, is able to develop mixed income affordable housing on those sites. And I think we can do a lot with the willingness and the eagerness of local jurisdictions who, in their school districts or their other entities that don't usually have the expertise development, they have just the assets and they have the vision, but they would love for someone else in the public interest to come and do it. And that's what this is going to be for.
We've been talking about the more technical and policy aspects of the plan, but as you know, there's also this political dimension of actually passing this bill through the legislature. I've been told that there's actually a pretty good prospects for getting this bill through in the near future. Can you describe the path towards actual enactment of this proposal and the coalition that's come around to support it?
Yeah, I feel very optimistic about this proposal. It's, of course, nothing is for granted and nothing is going to be easy about this paradigm shift, but we have the strong backing of our labor movement here, and not just the typical trades and construction trades that would obviously be interested in this, but also we have the nurses, our public sector employees, and even trying to think. A bunch of different unions are on board on this. They don't traditionally weigh in on housing, and that's because they realize that there is no ability to bargain your way out of an escalating housing crisis. No matter how much, realistically speaking, there is no way you can bargain wages to actually keep up with housing and affordability. So we have the unions, we have housing advocates, housing justice advocates we're bringing on, and I think we also have now approaching a dozen lawmakers who are co-authors from both houses, and including the chairs of, we have the support, but the co-authorship of one of the chairs of the housing committee on the other side, on the Senate, and the housing committee chair on our side is actually the chair of the select committee on social housing. And that's a lot of legislative jargon to say we're in a pretty good spot. And we have folks from Southern California and the Central Valley, and all the way to, of course, in the Bay Area where I am, that believe in this vision that there is another path. There is another path to solving your housing crisis, and it doesn't all have to be deregulation or nothing, right? There has to be more ways. And I really believe that we have to use as many policy instruments as possible. And one of the things that, California loves to boast that we're the 5th largest economy in the world, or its own nation state. But I think we can be very humble and learn from other countries, like a little country in Europe known as Austria, or a little nation state in the Pacific in Singapore, or even Taiwan with its own social housing programs. There's a lot we can learn from folks. And there is no reason with a mounting housing and affordability crisis and mounting homelessness crisis in California that we do not try everything we can. So the short way to say is I feel very confident we can get through the legislature, because we have a lot of great establishment support. We have a lot of great legislative support, and hope that we can have more advocate support on the ground as well.
Well, as somebody who's worked on this concept for many years here in Hawaii, I can say that even though you've summarized that in just a couple of minutes, I know that there's a lot that has to happen behind the scenes in order to line up all the ducks in a row, in order for a measure like this to be successful at the legislature. And so, if you are successful, it will still have to be implemented by the administration. And has the governor opined on this concept, and what kind of reception would you be expecting at the executive level?
Trying to figure out how to say this diplomatically. No, they have not engaged us on this yet, but it is also not irregular to not engage on bills early. For one, they don't engage on bills early, and that's just their style. Okay, I get it. That might be the case with your executive as well, with the legislative process in Hawaii. And two, it's a big paradigm shift from what folks are used to. So I do not anticipate them early on engaging, though we have been attempting. And in fact, early on when we first engaged the governor's office, they said, well, you should check in with all the executive agencies. There are a lot of agencies that touch on housing. And we did. We checked in with all of them, and they all said, this is not what we do, nor do we want to do it. That's all I needed to know. And all of what I figured, right? Traditionally, or right now, as it comes to housing in California, we act in two roles really, as regulators and as financiers, right? As grant underwriter or grant givers. Those are really what all our housing agencies do. They don't act as developers, they don't act as constructors. There are some things that are adjacent to these things, but they really only act in those two roles. We are trying to also consolidate and streamline those roles. For a lot of historical reasons, it's very messy. So many of agencies have very repetitive functions in some ways, where it's like we could definitely consolidate all our financing bodies. So we can consolidate our regulatory bodies. It just makes sense. It's just common sense. And I think we're going to be working on that. But even when you consolidate that, you see there's a missing hole in the middle is no one does development. No one advises on development. No one does it itself. So when in California, we have groundbreaking ceremonies for affordable housing projects, affordable housing developments in neighborhoods. You see the great ceremony, but there is a NASCAR poster of financiers. You have banks, you have counties, you have cities, you have this grant and that grant, right? It's so difficult. And even the lead agency that is developing it probably was not imagining themselves to be acting the developer in the first place. Now, this is also one of those things where we streamline government, we make it work, and we learn from other countries.
So, that's interesting that you decided to create a whole new agency to undertake this project. And, I can understand why the existing agencies would not want to, take on this large responsibility. But in terms of standing up a new agency from scratch, that presents its own challenges. Have you thought about how that would play out?
Yeah, of course, it's going to have some growing pains, I think. But I think we are at an interesting time, and this is also thanks to some of the work you've done, Senator Chang, too, is that I think the idea of social housing in America is growing in prominence. And there are so many great people who work in the nonprofit field, work in the housing justice field, work in even the private sector field, right, that are very excited about this concept. And I would hope once we prop this entity up and the state enterprise up, that there will be people who are very excited to do this work, who have this expertise. In fact, a lot of our bill is, written by activists, written by people who have some of this policy experience, but don't necessarily occupy these roles right now. I think there'll be a lot of people who want to work in this field, and it'll be a new emerging field. And I think that's why it's exciting. And I think obviously it'll be a divergence from the traditional role of a state government in California, but that hasn't stopped us before. We've created new entities to take on new challenges when we regulate, when we legalize new things or we embark on new missions. And they're always growing pains, I think. But I think so long as we have dedicated people to it, which I think is the key component to it, we're always going to be in a good place. And I think seeing the organic excitement about it, and with people who actually have the policy skills who are excited about it too, I think we'll be able to quickly fill these positions and actually have people who share the same vision. Because that's what I think the big rallying cry is. People united around social housing. And once we prop it up and be like, hey, come work for us at the California Housing Authority, and people like, sign me up. And they'll come and build amazing social housing across the state.
Well, that would certainly be an amazing accomplishment because, of course, California is the fifth largest economy in the world and is a leader in many ways in the policy arena. We're still getting a lot of questions that have to do with some of the specific aspects of cost. So are you prepared to say now what the median unit cost would be, how much you think you would be able to build a median unit or per square foot in terms of costs, and what kind of subsidies beyond, how the subsidy structure would look like a little bit more specifically, whether it's cross subsidization, whether it's taxpayer dollars, whether it's LIHTC and project-based Section 8, what would the cost structure look like here?
Yeah, so we're developing actually with the Legislative Analyst Office right now, but scenarios in which we can predict what the cost structure would be like, maybe on a consumer level or a resident level, about what this would look like. Until we conduct that analysis right now, I wouldn't be able to tell you what that price is, and a lot of it is, fortunately, it's variable, right? And hopefully that by the time we construct, right, and this analysis, of course, would happen as if it were being built today, right? Everything that changes from this time onward, unfortunately, might make it more expensive, or maybe something will change and everything gets cheaper with the costs. So that is what we are creating our estimates now. But the entire principle still rests on mixed income, right? Where we don't want it all to be where concentration of poverty or all just high-end housing for folks, right? It's the idea of social integration. And so right now we're not able to comment about what the exact figures look like. And I think it's a disservice if I told you like, oh, hey, yeah, rents are going to be $2,000 or something, right? Like I could not give you that number right now. It would not be responsible for me to tell you, unfortunately.
Okay, fair enough. You know, one question that we've dealt with a lot on this webinar is the question of people who, who like their neighborhoods exactly the way they are, and whether that phenomenon is called neighborhood defenders, as some academics call it, whether it's called not in my backyard or NIMBYism, whether it's called place attachment, a more psychologically based term. The ultimate sites where these projects would be located would be, probably quite controversial in those communities. What role would those communities have in selecting those sites? You're proposing a statewide agency, but the projects will have to go into communities, neighborhoods, counties, cities. Would those local communities have any say in where these projects would go?
Oh, they absolutely would have some say. They absolutely have say. It's actually in our bill about consultation about even dimensionalities of it. And I think that's really important. If I can go on a little side tangent, is when it comes to the folks who want to preserve the character of the community or how a community is like, or a neighborhood is like, I find that often it's about there's a lot of concern about how tall something is, how it looks, how, composition. So we actually very specifically even talk about in the consultation, we talk about the dimensions of it, right? We should talk about the dimensions of how many units there will be, how tall it will be, all that kind of aesthetic stuff, and also factor in the history of gentrification if there is a history of gentrification in that area, displacement. That's really important. Really factoring in those dimensions about the bill is important, and we want to seek the input, right? We want this to be a successful program that works hand in hand with local jurisdictions, where folks can feel that yes, there's a real housing need out there. We're missing this band of affordability, and this is where we want the state to come help us, right? This is in contrast to also in some ways approach of the carrot and stick, right? We have a lot of sticks right now, or we're starting to employ a lot more sticks with accountability units, with different accountability measures, but very little in terms of direct assistance in constructing those parts, right? We have all the tax schemes, we have all these things, but it is so important that we have tools in which we can fill the RHNA numbers or fill the affordable housing need that we have. So in short, to say, yes, there'll be a lot of local input, and we don't want to build things without having consensus.
Well, that's always going to be a challenge, as you know, in the housing arena, because I think this is, one of those very deeply held psychological phenomena. The desire that, one's physical surroundings should stay the way they are. And so, obviously we've seen a lot of proposals, start with a lot of momentum, but ultimately fall short when it comes to actually saying, this is where the project will go. And so, that consensus is really going to be critical. You mentioned that you are looking at these excess public lands, these surplus public lands. Would there be a consideration of using eminent domain or acquiring new land for the sites of these projects?
Yeah, I don't really foresee that to be the case, with land being one of the highest fixed costs, and there being a surplus of lands out there that we could theoretically achieve building housing, especially with the surplus lands. I think that should be the priority of it. In fact, we kind of prioritize, talking about in the production chapters, we actually prioritize that. It's so important that we make this happen as quickly as possible too, and leverage resources that we have. Going out and procuring private property while also being kind of, having a history of being destructive and displacing people, it's also economically not as viable with all property prices being the way they are, especially in transit-oriented areas. much more economically viable to try to work with other local agencies to say, hey, you've got this parcel, you want to do something with it, let's trade right now. Like let's trade or figure out some sort of arrangement in which we can build more housing. And that's actually what you see right now on a more scattered patchwork approach. Like there are some cities and counties that are great at figuring that out, and that's great. I think they also keep doing that. But there are also a lot of counties and jurisdictions that have no expertise and no ability to do that right now, and they need help. They need that additional boost. They need someone to help facilitate that, and that's good, important, right? And again, this is one more option amongst the many options that we should be having.
I think it's fair to say that with a severe housing shortage in California, the initial projects that are being built, there would be great demand for those projects. Is there a fair way to allocate those initial units and to select those initial residents?
Yeah, right now, when it comes to social housing residency, we are going to be in the bill employing lottery just by chance, right? That's the fairest way of doing it. There would be, I do imagine there'll be a great interest in living in social housing and a great need and desire and demand for it. But as we scale up, I think we're going to do something fairly as a lottery right now. I mean, always open to changing if there's a more fair system to do that,
Well, that'll definitely be a contested issue because, of course, every community will feel that it has been left out of the housing system for too long.
Absolutely.
But it's, another question that's come up multiple times from the audience already that we also get is, from the flip side, why are you confident that people who are paying market rate or paying a lot of money for housing will want to live in public housing, especially considering, the negative examples of the so-called projects that have been built over the last century in this country?
Yeah, that's always an interesting question that I do hear from people. Like, why would someone who is median income or above, why would they want to live in social housing? And I always pause to think. I was like, in my personal experience, I'm thinking, why would someone not? I couldn't think of the reasons why. And that's maybe because I'm approaching it as a renter. When you're a renter nowadays, why do you not take, for instance, all your options you have and say, well, this arrangement is here with this price point, et cetera, when you're shopping for housing, where you're figuring out your housing options. That is going to be the same calculus that people take in the open market or when social housing is there as well, right? It's going to be, well, this place, option A, has this many bedrooms, this kind of amenities, and option B is near a train station and it costs this much and it's a little cheaper or it has these things, right? And you choose between them. And in this option, maybe both of them are social housing or both of them are private. You didn't even know from what I'm talking about, right? So it's very possible that people just choose what they want, right? And the idea right now too, especially for the above median income folks, is right now, they have the same calculus when it's choosing housing, whether it be slightly more expensive, slightly less expensive. And that's also a problem that in the larger scope of the world is we have to also realize is people with larger incomes are also competing with people with smaller incomes on the open market right now. And that results in the bidding wars and the scarcity. It's all artificial scarcity. That all happens right now. And the other thing I was going to say is the hopeful thing, and this is one of my big goals in future, I think this will have to happen at scale, is we have enough social housing out there that holds to those tenants and doesn't want to overcharge people, that it is another market pressure, right? In a sense that if you have a bunch of units going for X amount price and every unit around there is 2X, right? Then the X just as a market factor becomes more attractive to the other buyers. And hopefully as a cost pressure, bring it down where people want to be competitive with each other, right? If they have similar amenities or similar dimensions. And that's why it's really important. And I really think about it, and, I think about it from my experience as a renter, certainly someone who has had to find my fair share of opportunities that fit my situation. And I think that's what's going to happen with folks with social housing as well. And there's actually examples still today, even in Sacramento, the city of our state capital, there is CADA, which I do not remember exactly what it stands for right now, but it is in essence a very mini scale social housing in which they own, develop, and maintain their own stock of rent controlled units out there. And that's also one of the options that people choose from often. And it's not physically distinguishable from any other housing that exists in the area. It's not stigmatized. And I know in America, there's Prut Igo and all the projects loom large in the American mindset. There's actually a lot more government driven or government subsidized housing around you that you know. And most people oftentimes don't even know that exists. And a great example too is in my district and also in Sacramento, there are actually housing, a large kind of apartment complex looking thing is actually for homeless veterans, or formerly homeless, I should say, formerly homeless veterans. And there is no real distinction that anyone would ever know the difference if you were to look at this building. And I'm sure, in the past, there was a great big hubbub about having that still not come up. But after time, there isn't, right? Because it just blends in. It's just one of those homes that exists. And I think that's the same thing. So I really think about it is if someone finds themselves asking, why would someone choose to live here? You should ask yourself also, why would they not? And also, why do they choose to live anywhere, right? Why do people now choose to spend 50% of their income on housing? Why do people now live 4 generations in one household? And that's probably because that's just the choices they have, right? They use the rational choices they have now to make the best decisions they have, or the best evidence and criteria they have now, and make the choices they have. And that's the unfortunate reality, is they don't have a lot of choices, and they make the best decisions they can for their housing decision. It's a very long-winded way of saying I think we will be okay. People will still choose to live there.
This conversation has really been focusing on supply, building new units for people. But I found, and even in this audience chat today, that there are a lot of folks who would rather prefer to focus on demand. In other words, making better use of the properties that are currently vacant, and also addressing the influx of buyers from out of state. Would you have anything to say to those folks who would say, you know what, before we go on this large public housing spree, let's really try to make sure that our vacant units are used, and that really our units of all kinds be occupied only by local folks who need them and not by external people?
Yeah, I mean, I always say we can do it all. We can chew gum and walk at the same time. And right now in San Francisco and in many cities across the state, they're talking about vacancy taxes. Even in San Jose, there was conversation about vacancy taxes in general. I have a bill right now in the legislature being opposed by the Realtors and the Apartment Association that actually curbs speculation of rent-controlled units, which is to reform the Ellis Act. That's like the shortest explanation I'll give. I don't want to dive too much in the weeds about it, but that's also the practice of flipping rent-controlled units into market rate. All that stuff exists at once, and all of that we can work at simultaneously, because the urgency of the matter and the magnitude of the housing crisis needs to be addressed all at once. I'm a true believer in the three P's approach. We have to produce more affordable housing, we have to preserve the affordable housing that exists now, and protect the people that live there, right? Because if all we did was preservation, we wouldn't get anywhere. If all we did was production, we would still be the same place. We have to have a balanced approach about it, and we can curb over commodification of housing through building non-commoditized housing, which is social housing, and we can also crack down on these really bad actors out there that are driving up home prices and really privatizing folks and displacing folks, right? All of that can happen at once. And I think it's important that we try everything at once, right? We have to have a comprehensive approach. And while we talk about this bill today, AB 2053, which is based on social housing, we're also working simultaneously on other things, like as I'm working on AB 2050 about the Ellis Act.
Okay, yeah, a ton of questions coming in. So I think there is a robust, continues to be a lot of questions about the technical aspects. So one is, certain proposals like the one that I've introduced, Aloha Homes in Hawaii, require that any residents not own other real property. Is that something that your proposal would also do?
So repeat that again about the real property.
So the only residents would be owner occupants who own no other real property. Is that a restriction that your proposal would also have to ensure that the people who are living in there are actual residents and not just speculators?
Yeah, in our bill, we specify that we specify that folks living in a different affordability units as their sole residence, with also, of course, generous exceptions about like, okay, if you have to leave the state for whatever reason, you can also exit your contract, exit your lease, etc. But the idea is to maintain the housing for Californians. But here's the other thing is when it comes to right now, the above median income units, we have less restriction on it. And that's because we want to be able to capture as much value as possible from what money would have gone into the private market back into the social housing to benefit those folks who directly live in those neighborhoods and directly benefit from social housing. And that's really important. Why cross-subsidization is so important, and something that is a different paradigm for people to understand, is we are not taking one abstract tax scheme or LIHTC or something to subsidize this other thing. This is direct wealth capture of folks who have higher incomes who help folks with lower incomes directly. No tax scheme involved. This is literally, in some ways, free housing.
Okay. All right. Well, I think I'm seeing a bunch of questions that celebrate the existing neighborhoods that we have in whether it's California or Hawaii, many of which are suburban, many of which would be single family homes. A lot of people really enjoy that lifestyle and may feel that something is being taken away when bills like this pass. What would you have to say to those individuals?
Sorry, repeat that one more time. I kind of cracked up for a second.
So, a lot of folks really do value the way of life that they have in their suburban communities, for example, with open spaces, with green spaces. They don't necessarily want to see greater urbanization. And yet that's something that those of us on the supply side of the equation, like myself, have really pushed. What would you say to those folks who say, that we don't want California to turn into Manhattan? And there is something valuable about these neighborhoods that have existed for a long time and that generations of Californians know and love.
Absolutely. I'm reminded of a quote we in the legislature talked about. I don't forget who said this anymore, but not every community will have to change the same way, but every community will have to change. That is the challenge of today. What happened in my district? My district is actually, my district is one of 2 Asian American majority districts in the entire state, congressionally the only Asian American majority district in the entire country. And how did that happen? My district used to be farm fields 50, 60 years ago. There's still some remnants of it too. There were orchards and farm fields. And how that happened was people decided that this is the new place to live. This is a place where we can subdivide, create new communities, and Silicon Valley was born there. It used to be called, before it was called Silicon Valley, where all the tech companies and all these places that you know of across the world, it used to be called the Valley of Hearts Light, known for strawberries and farm, things very different, right? But if it were not for those folks at the time thinking we need to grow and adapt to this new age, post-war age, my family would never be there. A lot of the families that bought their houses in the 70s, 60s, 50s even, who I have come to represent and know very well, who say, and especially when I knock on their doors and I talk to them, they say, if I were to do this all over again, get my tract home or rent style house, I would never be able to do that. I'd never be able to do this again, right? People realize things have changed. And if we do not change enough, it doesn't say we have to drastically upend everything we know about our community. We have to change somewhat to make sure that our grandchildren, our children can live near us, or else we will be unaffordable. It will be unaffordable to live here, and only the rich and those who can pay the premium of $1 million homes will be able to live in an area. And I don't think that's the kind of society you want to live in, right? We need to change enough so that everyone is able to live in the places they called home, that built it. And right now, if we do nothing, people that have built, maintained, and grew up in these communities, even the community I represent, will no longer be able to live there. They will no longer be able to live there with their children, their grandparents, etc., and they'll end up moving away. And you know what the great irony of the moving away part is? The affordability crisis follows them. And that's what we're seeing right now in California. The Bay Area, there's a great, I think, SF Chronicle piece that the Bay Area now includes like parts of the Central Valley and Sacramento, because we have all started moving. And that actually brings up the home prices and the affordability crises. We actually have a lot of allies on the Republican side, because they understand that if they want to preserve their way of rural living, they have to make sure the metropolitan areas also get their act together. Like that's why it's important. We have to all give a little to achieve a lot. And that's why I tell people, it's like, if we did not change from what we were pre-World War II, we'd not have been able to enjoy all the prosperity we did. And now we got to change again and meet the great new challenge in front of us. And just give a little bit of sacrifice, but in the end, the reward will be a lot bigger.
Well, it's very inspiring. And a lot of people in Hawaii would actually say that the Bay Area is starting to encompass Hawaii as well. I just saw the news from Meta that their founders are now half-time residents of the island of Kauai and half-time in the Bay Area, for example. So, the hour is late, especially in California, where you are Assembly member. You've been so generous with with your time. I think we can maybe close with just one more question, a broader question now, which is that, you initially introduced your first social housing bill last year in 2021, AB 387, and, AB 2053 that we've been discussing today is basically a reworked, or I guess more fully fleshed out version of that bill. What do you think are some of the top lessons you've learned over the past year while working on social housing? And what are some of the things that you would impart to those who would hope to start social housing programs in other jurisdictions outside of California?
Yeah. Well, two things, and also just thinking about what you said, there's a lot of Meta folks who are half-time in Hawaii. If you are concerned about other, especially Californians from the Bay Area, moving into your areas and changing things, help us build more housing where I am, and we will stay here because we want to stay here. I actually represent the third most populous assembly district in the entire state, and that's because in the decade, so much growth we have achieved, but also there's so much overpacking and overdensity in this thing. I have a overwhelmingly suburban district, and yet that has happened. But what I would tell people as they try to figure out social housing for their concept is really work with their community, work with the advocates. Really, honestly speaking, we wrote this bill from scratch. There were a lot of folks interested conceptually in social housing that were interested in it more conceptually, but no one had any architecture for us to, in the California context, to really borrow from, right? Because we have our own set of parameters and rules and all that kind of stuff and legal environment where we really need to pick up and figure something out. So we wrote it from scratch. And I think the most thing I learned most is I really want to work constructively with everyone to build this proposal from the ground up. And that's for listening for folks who want to work in good faith. And that's how we built out a 20-page bill. Is we listen to folks from the labor movement, we listen to activists, we listen to folks who want to preserve the community, we listen to people in local government. And while that's a lot of work, and why we had to pause the bill from last year and come back to that, it was a whole year's worth of negotiating. And still, it's not perfect. There are things to work on. There's things to amend, there's things to add, there's things to delete. That's how you do it, right? And as long as you have a strong uniting vision based on principles, you can get it done that way, I hope. And I am seeing more local jurisdictions in California, even counties and cities, trying to embark on their own social housing programs. That will be different, right? It's going to be different in different contexts. But it's really heartening to see this movement spread out.
Great. Well, thank you again for being so generous with your time, Assembly member, and for proposing such a bold proposal that has already had so many impacts on the housing conversation around the country. So we look forward to seeing what happens next with your bill, and hopefully, we'll have some good news about it soon.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me on here, and appreciate the conversation. Thank you, Stanley.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.